at the front that shows
I mean, like, I was going to say because of the snow.
Welcome everyone. We're going to get started.
Yes.
Can everybody hear me? You can hear me? All right. I'll try to talk a little closer. So welcome to the Hudson Area Library's Local History Speaker Series. My name is Emily Shanitas. I'm the director here at the Hudson Area Library. For anyone who hasn't been here before, welcome and thank you for joining us for your first time. For anyone who hasn't joined us while we are open, we hope you'll stop by sometime during our open hours, and especially as you're seemingly interested in history, we have a wonderful local history room that's open select hours of the week. It's open Tuesdays 10 to 12 and 2 to 6 p.m., Wednesdays 4 to 6 p.m., and Saturdays from 10 to 12. It's a wonderful resource here in the community with a wonderful book collection, photographs, and other ephemera and resources, and wonderful volunteers to help do research on local history interests. So we hope you'll come visit us. We are now open 7 days a week as well, so please stop by. We're very happy to be co-sponsoring this event tonight with the Jacob Leisler Institute for the Study of Early New York History. They're an independent, not-for-profit research center devoted to collecting, preserving, and disseminating information related to colonial New York under English rule. I'm going to introduce David in a moment, but I also wanted to let you all know about our next local history speaker series. It's going to be on Thursday, March 22nd at 6 p.m. here in the community room. And it is called the General Worth Hotel, Hudson's Grand Second Home, and it will be offered by Gary Sheffer. There are flyers on the back table if you'd like to take one home with you to keep that fresh in your memory. But now I'm going to introduce David, our speaker for this evening. David Voorhees is a former history editor at Charles Scribner's Sons, editor of the papers of the first New Jersey State Governor William Livingston, and managing editor of the Holland Society's Journal.
The Hobnob.
The Hobnob. I'm not good with Dutch. And there's some copies of the magazine at the back as well. He's a graduate of New York University. He specializes in colonial New York history. And several years ago, he established the Jacob Leisler Institute for the Study of Early New York History in Hudson, about which he will be speaking to us this evening. So without further ado, here's David.
Thank you, Emily. I would also like to thank the Hudson Area Library and the Gotham History Center for co-hosting this presentation on the Jacob Leisler Institute. In addition, I would like to recognize the Institute's Board of Trustees, volunteers, and student interns who worked so hard to promote our vision. In April 1680, Dutch visitor Jasper Dankers boarded a sloop from Manhattan for Albany. We left New York City, he wrote in his journal, in company with about 20 passengers of all kinds, young and old, who made great noise and bustle. And as though these people lived in the interior of the country, somewhat nearer to the Indians, they are more wild and untamed, reckless, unrestricted, haughty, and more addicted to misusing the blessed name of God and to cursing and swearing. Nearly a century later, in 1774, John Adams made this observation about Manhattanites. With all the opulence and splendor of this city, there is very little good breeding to be found. They talk very loud, very fast, and all together. If they ask you a question, before you can utter 3 words of your answer, they will break out upon you again and talk away. Although these observations seem contemptuous, they reveal something else. Contemporary visitors viewed colonial New York and East Jersey's populations not as the slumbering Dutch caricatures later portrayed in Washington Irving's popular early 19th century novels, but as the dynamic and tumultuous peoples they are still often viewed as today. It is this vitality that the Jacob Leisler Institute has been established to explore and explain. Nothing demonstrates this vitality more than the explosive growth of the region's non-indigenous population. When in 1674, the Treaty of Westminster ended the Third Anglo-Dutch War and restored New Netherland to the English for the second time, the European population of New York was approximately 9,830 people, and that of East Jersey, 1,000, with about an additional 2,000 Africans between the two. A century later, on the eve of the American Revolution, colonial New York's population had soared to nearly 200,000, and East Jersey to 44,000, with approximately 10% of the population being of African descent. Moreover, New York City had grown to become a sizable port town of 25,000 inhabitants. That by the 1770s, closely connected farms and villages spread across Long Island, west into the Raritan Valley, and up the Hudson River and into the Mohawk River Valley. This 1760s map shows the state of development of the mid-Hudson, Claverick, Lunenburg, Catskill region, which presented by this period, as local historian Ruth Pywanka notes, a relatively dense rural population consistent with 120 years Dutch occupancy. A central figure in the story of English colonial New York and East Jersey is Jacob Leisler. But who is Jacob Leisler? To uncover his story, the Leisler Institute began as an outgrowth of my doctoral research into the impact on New York of England's 1688 Glorious Revolution, when the Protestant Dutch stadtholder, William III, Prince of Orange, and his wife, Mary, replaced her father and his uncle, the Roman Catholic King James II, on England's throne. News of the Prince of Orange invasion and of James Stuart's subsequent flight from England led to unrest in all the American colonies. In February 1689, wealthy New York City merchant Jacob Leisler received printed copies of the Prince's 4 declarations justifying his actions, quote, to preserve the people of England from the cruel rage and bloody revenge of the Papists. When New York's officials refused to declare for the new king, Leisler, along with his militia company, seized Fort James on Manhattan on behalf of the new king. Leisler's declarations, his May 31st declaration in cipher here on the right, were based on William III's. A provincial committee of safety subsequently elected Leisler commander-in-chief of the province in August, and the following December, upon receipt of royal letters addressed to whomever was taking care of the government, he assumed the title of lieutenant governor. His faction's administration, which increasingly took draconian measures against its opposition, created deep bitterness. When the new royal governor, Henry Slaughter, arrived in 1691, Leisler's enemies had him arrested and placed on trial for treason. On Saturday, May 16, 1691, in a cold, drizzling rain, Jacob Leisler and his new son-in-law and chief advisor, Jacob Milbourne, climbed the scaffold on the edge of present-day City Hall Park near the current entrance to the Brooklyn Bridge. The 2 men were being executed for high treason against the English crown before the largest crowd Manhattan had yet seen. Hanged by their necks until half dead, the two men were taken down and beheaded. The shrieks of the people were dreadful, it was reported, especially the women. Some fainted, some taken in labor. The crowd cut off pieces of Leisler's garments as precious relics, and of his hair also, out of their great respect for a martyr. Despite opposition, Leisler was extremely popular, and his execution turned him into a martyr for the Protestant cause and liberty. News of Leisler's beheading rapidly spread. Samuel Sewall in Boston recorded on May 21st that a crowd had gathered at his gate about 7 o'clock, where Ben Harris told him that Captain Leisler and Mr. Milbourne were executed last Saturday, whereas most were pleasing themselves that there was like to be no such thing. Within 6 weeks, the London Gazette, Amsterdam's Courant, and other European papers were reporting their deaths. In August 1691, the States of Holland, and in 1692, the English Crown launched investigations into the executions, and in spring 1695, England's Parliament began hearings. On May 2nd, 1695, Parliament reversed the New York court sentence of attainder against Leisler and Milbourne, and in the process cleared them of the charges of treason. Historians generally recognize that the events surrounding Leisler's administration and execution colored New York politics up to the American Revolution. Indeed, in 1766, the New York Assembly appended to their published minutes a copy of Parliament's May 1695 Act for the satisfaction of the public and in justice to the family and descendants of said Captain Leisler. For the next 3 centuries, Leisler remained a topic for prints, novels, plays, and histories. In the 1930s, Germany's Third Reich portrayed him as an icon of Germanic heroism against English aggression. Nonetheless, the popular image of Leisler increasingly became, despite scholarly criticism, that of an illiterate soldier who married a rich Dutch widow, prospered through her connections, remained snubbed by New York's elite, and in 1689 led a Dutch uprising against English aristocratic rule in New York. While researching for my thesis, I, however, became surprised to discover not only was Leisler not illiterate, but he read and wrote in German, French, Dutch, English, and New Latin. Moreover, he played a prominent role in ecclesiastic and civic affairs. Between 1670 and 1683, he served as a deacon in the New York City Dutch Reformed Church, as an English Admiralty Court Justice, a New York County Justice of the Peace, and as a militia captain. The 1683 Dutch manuscript in Leisler's hand on left involves a church land transaction. On the right, in Leisler's hand in English, is the determination in a domestic dispute between Jan Digne, allegedly the first European male born in New Netherlands, and his second wife, Nice Hughes. I established the Jacob Leisler Papers Project at New York University under the auspices of the National Historical Publication and Records Commission. The manuscript collection grew to about 4,000 document photocopies, as well as a large number of books, maps, prints, genealogical materials, and other memorabilia relating to Jacob Leisler, his immediate family, and those appearing in his correspondence. In 2014, I moved the Leisler collection here to Hudson, an area rich in Leislerian associations. The Stotts family of Stockport were among Leisler's staunchest supporters. Daughter Hester Leisler would marry Joachim Stotts. Local Jacob Jans van Hoosen, among others, named his children Leisler and Milborn. And the legacy of the rebellion lived on in this region. Leisler was born in the midst of the 30 Years' War in the Imperial Free German city of Frankfurt am Main in March 1640, a son of Frankfurt's French Reformed pastor, Jacob Victorian Leisler. Frankfurt, located on the Rhine and Main rivers with its twice-yearly book fairs, was a major European currency exchange and publishing center. Leisler's family was prominent in Reformation affairs as jurists, clergymen, and academics. His paternal grandfather, Dr. Jacob Leisler, believed portrayed in this 1592 painting, served as chief counsel to the Counts of Oettingen and later civil prosecutor for Prince Christian of Anhalt, governor of the Upper Palatinate. On his maternal side, his great-grandfather, Jacob Wissenbach, was the first Reformed pastor in Hesse-Nassau to the brother of William the Silent, the Prince of Orange. His mother's cousin was famed jurist Johann Jacobus Wissenbach. Moreover, Leisler was a direct descendant of John Calvin's Geneva syndic Henri Aubert, and related to renowned Huguenot theologian Simon Goulart. Leisler's father succeeded Goulart's son-in-law, Timothy Potiret, as Frankfurt's French Reformed minister. This background shaped Leisler's character after his father's untimely death when Jacob was 12. In April 1660, at age 20, he enlisted in the Dutch West India Company to serve as an officer in the Esopus War in New Netherlands. The war, however, ended as he landed in New Amsterdam in July 1660, depicted here by history painter Len Tantillo. To alleviate suffering among Calvinist refugees in the Palatinate during the 30 Years' War, Reformed churches throughout Europe and Britain established a fund centered at the Reformed Church of St. Martha in Nuremberg, where Jacob Leisler's aunt and uncle attended services. Leisler's father played a prominent role in these relief efforts. Others active in this network included English mathematician John Pell, whose extensive holdings on Westchester Peninsula in New York Leisler later became involved in for another Calvinist refugee relief effort in the 1680s. French King Louis XIV's revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 and subsequent persecutions of French Protestants motivated Leisler's commitment to Calvinist relief. In 1687, he began negotiations with John Pell's nephew in New York to purchase 6,100 acres for the establishment of a Huguenot refugee community called New Rochelle. The sale was completed in September 1689. Sculptor Solon Borglum's statue of Leisler in New Rochelle, seen here, commemorates this event. Shortly after his arrival in New Netherlands, Leisler abandoned a military career and emerged as one of New York's richest merchants. The Institute's large collection of trade documents include records of his export of furs, tobacco, grains, minerals, whale oil, and lumber to Europe and the West Indies, and the import of an astonishing array of European manufactured goods, Asian spices, and African slaves. Leisler's import of such luxuries as hair towers for women, and boxes of toys provide new insights into the development of New York's colonial economy. In 1663, he acquired property on Pearl Street in New Amsterdam through his marriage to Elsie Timons, widow of merchant Peter Cornelis van der Veen and stepdaughter of the city's richest merchant, Govert Lokermans. Leisler expanded this property with subsequent purchases and 6 years later built the first all-brick residence by a private Manhattan merchant, next to the townhouse of West India Company Director General Petrus Stuyvesant. Jasper Dankert sketched Leisler's house in this panoramic view he drew of the city in 1679. Leisler became a large landholder with substantial properties on Manhattan, Long Island, and in Westchester County. His acquisition through inheritance of the estates of his wife's stepfather, Govert Lokermans, was bitterly contested by his wife's stepsister's families, the Byards, Kiersteders, and Van Cortlands. Leisler's success in the courts created familial bitterness that flared into the political arena in 1689 when his in-laws led the opposition to his government. By the 1670s, Leisler was also one of the primary New Yorkers involved in the Chesapeake tobacco trade, as well as an importer of slaves into that region. But the contradiction between Leisler as a slaver and owner, while later decrying papist enslavement of Protestants, reveals the troubling complexities of the development of black chattel slavery in the Atlantic world. In August 1676, Leisler attended a sermon on original sin given by Almany Domini Nicholas Van Rensselaer. Van Rensselaer, a controversial personality fostered by James as Duke of York upon the Albany Reformed congregation, faced much opposition from Calvinists. Leisler's four-point criticism of Van Rensselaer's sermon resulted in a slander suit that rent the province. The court case, of which the Institute has virtually complete records, involved current theological arguments justifying the enslavement of Africans as a result of original sin, an argument that Leisler soundly rejected. Indeed, contrary to the then prevailing practice, he baptized and educated his slaves in Christianity to ensure their souls would be saved. To make this story more complex is a little-known aspect of the early modern North African trade in European slaves. Indeed, Barbary pirates captured and sold into Africa and the Middle East nearly 2 million European men, women, and children. Among them was Jacob Leisler himself. In October 1677, Leisler's Pink Susanna, with him, his stepsons, wife's nephew, and New York crew, was captured by Algerian corsairs while sailing in the English Channel. The Institute's collection details the captivity and complex Anglo-Dutch negotiations through the Jewish community to ransom the captives before they went onto the slave block. Shown here is the English consul to Algiers' 1678 list of captured ships and captains, including the Susanna and Leisler. Though Leisler rapidly obtained his ransom, the event traumatized him. Moreover, his stepson Cornelis died in captivity, as a translation of a 1680 Dutch notarial document reveals, while his other stepson returned to New York permanently damaged. Collecting biographical information relating to Leisler family slaves is a goal of the Leisler Institute. Sadly, the story of the African diaspora in New York is not noble. The stirrings of democratic equality initiated by Leisler was subsequently harshly denied to New York's black population. In 1712, a slave uprising briefly terrorized Manhattan until brutally quelled. Thereafter, slave laws became more repressive. Despite draconian measures to maintain control, white fears of slave revolts so paralyzed the region that when false rumors of an uprising spread, it resulted in the hysteria known as the so-called 1741 Negro Conspiracy. Understanding Leisler's legal legacy is also an institute goal. In 1701, the New York City Mayor's Court adopted its first code of civil procedure. The code, drafted by recently installed city recorder, Leisler's former secretary, and now his son-in-law, Abraham Grosvenor, implemented Leisler's 1689-1690 synthesis of Calvinist ideology, Dutch Republican traditions, and English law. Such synthesis made New York, as historian Douglas Greenberg wrote about New York's judicial system, unique among the British colonies in North America. An example of this legal legacy is a 1734 trial of German-born printer John Peter Zenger. Zenger became embroiled in a dispute between Colonial Governor William Cosby and Leislerian factional leader Lewis Morris. Zenger's New York Weekly Journal criticized the royal governor. Cosby condemned Zenger's, quote, diverse, scandalous, virulent, false, and seditious reflections, and charged him with libel. After more than 8 months in prison, Zenger went on trial. The case for Zenger was won on the merits that a statement, even if defamatory, is not libelous if it can be proved true, thus affirming freedom of the press in America. As Leislerians and anti-Leislerians battled for political control, Leisler's children, daughters Mary and Hester portrayed here in middle age, emerged as powerful individuals in New York's economic, social, and cultural development. Their own children's marriages with their Bayard, Provost, Van Cortlandt, Van Rensselaer, Schuyler, and other cousins solidified the family within the Anglo-Dutch oligarchy that dominated New York and East Jersey for the next century and a half. Their papers augment the Institute's collections. The Institute's collections are further augmented by the acquisitions of the papers of the late Dr. Eric Noder, largely relating to colonial Western Long Island, of the late Mary Shepard Hollenbeck, relating to colonial Claverack, and the Holland Society's de Havemont files going back to 1885, which provide a wealth of genealogical information relating to the colonial period in New York. Among these materials are those relating to an amazing event that occurred within the precincts of the present-day city of Hudson in 1705. In that year, a spring flood caused a portion of the bank to collapse, revealing large bones. The sight drew the curious and was broadcast in the Boston Newsletter on July 30th, 1705. Peter Van Brueggen, a New York Assembly member from Albany, purchased a fossilized tooth from a farmer in the early summer for a half pint of rum and brought it to New York City to exhibit. Arguments raged over whether the bones belonged to a giant or were the remains of a beast. Fossilized seashells in Beecraft Mountain lime added to the controversy. Edward Taylor, pastor of the Church of Christ in Westfield, Massachusetts, wrote an epic poem on them. Boston Divine Cotton Mather, pictured here, believed they were physical proof of Noah's flood and the pre-flood giants recorded in Genesis. Native peoples recounted that several centuries earlier, a giant existed who stood as high as the top of the pine trees, knocked down bears from the treetops, and caught huge sturgeon in the water 3, 4, or 5 at a time. Eventually, New York Governor Lord Cornbury sent the bones to the Royal Society in London, then presided over by Sir Isaac Newton. Although it would be several decades before it was fully understood that the bones were those of an extinct mastodon, the giant had a profound international impact. Indeed, this Hudson event is the foundation for the modern scientific discipline of paleontology, the study of fossils. The foregoing barely touches upon the materials held in the Jacob Leisler Institute collections. In order to organize, catalog, and preserve these manuscripts, prints, and maps, and genealogical materials, the Institute relies on the aid of local volunteers. Beginning in 2016, SUNY New Paltz began providing the Institute with student interns. And in summer 2017, the Institute hosted a student intern from Hawthorne Valley. The intention is to train younger scholars with the means to preserve these valuable materials for future generations. One objective is to make the manuscript collections easily accessible through full transcriptions and translations of each document, and to provide those interested with the tools to advance their research. Moreover, the Institute serves as a place where scholars can gather and debate the events shaped by Jacob Leisler and his world. This concludes the inaugural presentation of the Jacob Leisler Institute lecture series. The next lecture in April will be by Dr. William Starna, SUNY Oneonta Professor Emeritus of Anthropology, on New York's Indian tribes. A third lecture will occur in June. The Leisler Institute is open to the public with visitation upon request. I hope you enjoyed our presentation and will participate with us in our endeavor to preserve the records of this important period. Thank you.
Question. I came a little bit late, but you mentioned, I believe, Melbourne was executed with Leisler. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Could you describe briefly who Melbourne was, and is there any connection with Melbourne, Australia, where I'm going to in July?
Well, that's Melbourne, and this is Milbourne with an I. No, there's no connection.
Okay.
But Jacob Milbourne was a member of a very radical Reform Calvinist family in England, and he had actually been married originally to a daughter. He'd been married previously, but his wife had died in 1690 of smallpox. And he became Jacob Leisler's son-in-law in 1691, just before their execution. He was a well-known rebel rouser throughout the English Atlantic world. Cynthia.
Was it pretty unusual for people to be beheaded? You don't really hear about a lot of beheadings in American history.
Well, we cover up a lot. If you want to know the truth, they'll tell you that there were many, there were much more violent people. The original charge against Leisler was that they were going to, and Milbourne was they were going to be hung till half dead, disemboweled, and their intestines burned before their faces while they were still alive. Then they were going to be beheaded and drawn and quartered, and the parts of their body were going to be distributed. That was the standard court sentence against someone who had committed treason. But because the trial basically was done illegally, the governor commuted the sentence to just having them hung till half dead and beheaded.
How kind.
And ironically, as soon as his head was taken off, when they collected the body, they collected the heads and sewed them back on the bodies. And if you know about the resurrection of the body, it's the firm belief in Christianity that the body will be resurrected after the second coming of Christ. That was one of the reasons. If you separated the head from the body could no longer be resurrected in full.
Yeah, but could you explain a little more about who was the leader of the group with the charge of treason against Leisler?
Well, basically, it was the Bayard family. It was Nicholas Bayard was the basic instigator, but they were his wife's in-laws, and they were his in-laws through his wife. They married her stepsisters, and they have been battling over the estate, which was a very rich estate, for about 15 years. And as these family feuds became a really, really nasty affair between the two of them. Oh, there definitely were very different political stances involved. That side of the family had been appointed to offices by James II. And with the outbreak of the revolution, when William came in, nobody was really quite certain. First off, news here was like 6 to 8 weeks. Second off, there was a French blockade of England, so it was hard to get news through. So official news was not coming to this side of the Atlantic. On top of it, until the Battle of Boyne in Ireland in 1690, nobody was sure that James was not going to be restored to the throne and executed like Monmouth had been in 1685. There had been an uprising before in England against James II. So people were playing both sides. So then Leisler's relatives refused to declare, and then Leisler declared instead. And they became very bitter in their contest for power.
So, I mean, it seems to me that part of their objective was to gain control, regain control of that estate. Did they achieve that objective by having him killed off?
What happens is initially they gain political control, but under William, New York is there's a lot that I am leaving out. New York had been included with New England and what's known as the Dominion of New England, and had become then just a sub-territory within this larger colony. With the rebellion and William's ascension to the crown, New York was restored and granted its own assembly, which it had only had under Leisler and then previously, very briefly, under Governor Thomas Dongan. So
what I was trying to say is they've been fighting for 15 years over his wife's estate.
To resolve that part,
did they get control of it after they knocked him off? I mean,
well, initially they did. Then when Parliament restored the properties to the family got them back, and the way the whole legal battle that had been going on for like a generation was resolved is that the cousins married. That the grandchildren of both sides intermarried. So all descendants of Jacob Leisler are also descendants of his opponents, which is very interesting, and that's how it resolved in this period. And that's why when William Smith wrote his history and he wrote a negative report about Jacob Leisler, it was pretty much agreed upon. One never discussed it because people were descended from both sides, so you had to be very careful. And, you know.
Are the modern descendants still around?
Yes, there are. Yes.
Understanding that in November, Leisler sent Milborn up to seize Albany from the convention, but it didn't actually result in armed conflict. I guess the two questions would be, did there ever come a point where the Albany Convention and Leisler's government come head-to-head in armed conflict, or was it always political? And then as a follow-up, did they ever view the French as the greater threat, or was the animosity so great that they viewed each other as a bigger threat than the French?
Okay, I got a lot of questions in there. The first one is, yes, Milburn was sent with a troop of militia to take over the government on behalf of, not Leisler, but on behalf of the Committee of Safety, which was then in control of the lower Hudson Valley. The Albany Convention refused to turn themselves over to the Milburn's militia, and their Iroquois Mohawk allies appeared and threatened to attack Milburn's forces, so they retreated. In February of 1690 is the very famous Schenectady Massacre, in which the French and Indian forces invade and basically destroy Schenectady. There's so much going on that I would be here for like a month trying to tell you everything that was happening. It's a very rich and exciting period. After the Schenectady Massacre, the Leislerian faction in Albany did take over the government of Albany on behalf of Jacob Leisler. So, briefly then, Albany was under the control of Leisler, yes. I mean, there's a lot more involved in all this. I mean, Leisler also called the first intercolonial conference in American history when he asked representatives from both New England and from the southern colonies to come to New York. Most of them sent representatives except for Virginia and Pennsylvania and the Carolinas, or Carolina at that point. But the Maryland delegates arrived afterward. There's a smallpox epidemic going on at this point in time, and so there's a lot going on with all of this. And then Leisler creates an invasion of Canada, of Quebec, which the land invasion does not succeed, the naval invasion does succeed.
I wonder how significant the discovery of what turned out to be Mastodon bones on the banks here that get realized eventually in research back in London. How remarkable was that discovery in the course of those discoveries across the years?
How remarkable. I mean, it was extremely remarkable. It brought international attention.
Was that like the first great discovery of Mastodon?
Well, it's not the first. It's the first time that they're seriously studied from a scientific view. Previously, anything that like this was found was always to believe like a monster or something from before the flood.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the first time that actual, what we would call scientific studies were undertaken. And so it's generally considered the event in the creation of the paleontology, of the science of paleontology.
And what was the year again of that?
1705.
1705.
And then, as you know, New York became later. There's a lot of paintings, or some paintings, which show excavations going on, digging up bones of animals throughout the Hudson Valley.
Where was that found?
It was found, I believe, they're not exactly sure, but I believe it was found on where the clavers are.
The what?
The clavers, the north. Right, just north, North Bay.
Oh.
There was a flood, and from my research, and I know that this could be disputed, that there was actually, I think, originally 3 or 4, and then another one appears in later, like in the Penfield map, I think there are 5. And I believe that one of those was created during, which one was created?
So they found the teeth, but there must have been the rest of the animal there. I mean, they didn't.
No, they found a lot of bones.
Oh,
But what happened is when the bones were exposed, they started to disintegrate.
Oh,
And of course, you also had a huge amount of tourists come. I mean, there were a lot of Native Americans that came to view these because they thought they were these sacred giants. And people were coming from Boston and
so it
from
was
New York
kind of
City.
dispersed,
And,
yeah.
I'm sorry?
It was dispersed then.
Right, but the bones still exist in the tooth still exists in the British Museum.
Okay.
This is invasion to Canada. Were they afraid of strong Catholic influence?
They were afraid that because James II was alive with his cousin, who was Louis XIV, and I don't know how many of you know international history during this period of time, but Louis XIV had revoked the Edict of Toleration, known as the Edict of Nantes, and began really serious persecutions of Protestants, poisonings of them, and all kinds of things, putting them in slavery on galleys. And there was a real fear, and it was known in New York that there were plans afoot to have the French Catholics come down the Hudson River and seize New York and to imprison any French Protestants that were found here, and of course basically enslave them, and then of course for the rest of the Protestant population. Because we're still living in the era of the Reformation, and there's this struggle going on. Ironically, what happens, and this is another side thing, is that Leisler's next youngest brother had gone to Geneva to become a Reformed, a Calvinist minister. He left the ministry, went into the service of the Swiss Guards, who were in the service of Louis XIV, converted to Roman Catholicism, played a prominent role in the Dragonades in France, which is the people who were, and was eventually knighted. The family was knighted by Louis XIV, so that branch of the family. So,
When Leisler and his family were captured in North Africa to become slaves, who would they be slaves to if they had gone jumping?
Initially they were put to work by the Algerians on working on fortifications, and Leisler, because they would examine you just like Europeans examined Africans. They would examine you for your health, they would look at your teeth, they would look at your hands, they would be able to determine your class. So they would know first off, if they went for your ransom, what kind of money they could get. Now obviously Leisler never worked with his hands because the ransom demanded for him was higher than what was demanded for an English governor. So he had all the characteristics of a very wealthy person. He was kept at the English consul's home and very early obtained that ransom, probably from the English government. But the rest of the crew were put into holding pens and then forced to work on the fortifications until they were released. And obviously the treatment was terrible because the one stepson died over there, and the other one came back basically a vegetable. So it's just very interesting because I don't know, I can't find after this point Leisler ever dealing, he had slaves, but he also had indentured servants. I mean, he had a lot of hired employees and wage laborers, but I don't find him importing slaves after that point when he returns. Now, maybe I'm missing something. But.
So what would have been their fate if they hadn't met the ransom?
They would have been put on a slave block and then sold.
And sold to?
Sold into Africa, sold to North Africans, sold into the Muslim world. I mean, there's not an extensive literature in America about it, but there is an extensive literature in Europe about it. And Africans have written about it too. I mean, I guess it's a sensitive topic here. Yes?
Going back to the fossils that were found, I sent you an early map of Hudson, very early map,
Right.
where the map maker made an extensive comment on the fossils he saw on Beecraft Mountain.
Right.
And I thought that was very interesting. This was well before Darwin.
Well, they originally believed because of the flood, the biblical flood, of course, covered the whole earth. And so the seashells and everything on the top of Beecraft Mountain were obviously the result of the biblical flood because the waters had gone that high, and then the sea animals were covering the earth up there in the mountain. Yeah, Tom.
Did anyone from England travel to this area after they received the teeth of the Mastodon?
That I don't know. Probably, but I don't know. I mean, there's so much we don't know. That's one of the things. I'm just in dealing with Jacob Leisler, I was shocked, and that's why I call it New York's neglected period, because there was so much information, and most of it has been just totally ignored or not looked at. Now, there's terrific work being done on New Netherland by the New Netherland Institute in Albany. So I mean, make it perfectly clear, I am not duplicating their brilliant research into the Dutch period. But I am looking into the period that is being totally neglected and has so much going on. So many peoples are coming in, the Palatines, and you see these connections with the Palatinate, with the Leisler family. You have the Huguenots coming in and creating all these communities. The Scots-Irish are coming in. There's what happens with the manors and the manor lords, which I did not go into in this presentation, but you have the uprising in 1766, I think. The beginnings of the riots against the manor lords. And you have the spread of the press in New York during this period. You have a huge change in standard of living that goes on, particularly in the 1720s and 1730s, which is why you find so many brick buildings in this area. It's like the Van Hoosen House. If you just go through the raw areas of Columbia County and you go back, and you'll see a lot of Dutch houses from this period. And then there's the whole concept of what was Dutch during this period, because it really isn't what the contemporary Dutch were doing at that period. So there's so many questions and that's the whole point of my institute.
So, what perked your interest in this gentleman?
You want to know the truth? It was my doctoral advisor. She said, nobody knows anything about this man, and he's such an important and pivotal character for, in New York history. And so she kind of guided me into, and then I got hooked, and now I can't stop. Sarah.
Like, where are you finding all these records, and how did they get preserved for so long?
They're all, I'm searching everywhere. They're all over the place. They're all over Europe, England, in the United States, and different archives in California, and they're just everywhere. Private collections. And there's just a lot of records that have never been really studied. And unfortunately, the worst thing is that New York City at one point was throwing all their records out. And that's a problem that's going on today with the idea that everything's going to be online and digitized, so let's throw out the records. It'll all be preserved, which I'm totally opposed. To me, digital materials are a tool to help, but they are not. They should not be the end all of maintaining our knowledge. Anything else? Oh, Ian.
Is anything I believe you mentioned a statue. Was that Leisler?
That's Leisler.
Yeah. Is there anything else that is either named after him besides your institute, like a town or?
Well, if you go to Frankfurt on Main, there's a Leisler street. Yes, there are. I mean, there are places, not towns, no, but it was such a it was the whole episode became such a political hot potato in the late 17th and 18th century, and these battles were these contests between the two factions became very strenuous. So, but there are memorials that have been left to him. Yes, in Manhattan and elsewhere.
So where did the descendants end up, basically, if you want to?
Well, it's like all the descendants from the colonial period. They're all over.
So are there any of them that stayed locally, though? Do we have any local Leisler descendants?
You mean here in Columbia County? Not that I know of. No. No,
What
but
about New York City?
they're in New York. They're in Massachusetts. One of the advisors to the Institute is a direct descendant of one of Leisler's brother. Her family had a lot of papers and materials that had been passed down through that branch of the family. The family was very prominent in Europe. Tom.
After the people in England found that Leisler was innocent and should never have been executed,
Right.
was there any, I'll use the word, judgment placed on the executioners? And did his family receive any restitution?
The family, okay. It's a very difficult legal situation because during Leisler's administration, a lot of laws were passed that to overturn, and then when he was executed, of course, those laws were overturned. So what they did is they reversed Leisler's, the attainder against Leisler and his family, which meant their estates were restored, which meant that they were no longer charged with treason. However, they could not go any further and say that his administration was legal because it would have created a huge mess in the courts over all kinds of deeds and wills, all kinds of stuff. So that they did not do. But what happens is that initially the anti-Leislerians are in power, and then a new governor, Lord Bellamont, comes in, and the Leislerians then take over the government, and they become in power, and Leisler's son-in-laws become the governor's council, and the assembly becomes all Leislerians. Sounds very familiar to what goes on today between. And then they charged Nicholas Bayard, who had been the main proponent for getting Leisler executed, with treason. So then he went through a treason trial and just barely escaped being executed himself. And ironically then, his grandson marries Leisler's granddaughter. That's really the end of the dispute on the elite level. The dispute, particularly locally, goes on until the 1760s in this area. You can find Leislerian and anti-Leislerians fighting over land and all kinds of stuff, so it continues.
They know where he's buried, they don't.
He was buried in the Garden Street Reformed Church. He was buried inside the Garden Street Reformed Church. The church was burned to the ground in the fire in the early 19th century. I believe there is part of a casket in the New York Historical Society that I believe is probably Leisler's, part of Leisler's casket. Because at the time the New York Historical Society was created, this was the time of the fire. And the only thing they have is an unknown Dutch governor. Well, that's the only unknown Dutch governor that they have, that they don't know where the grave is. So I believe it's in the New York Historical Society. Okay. Anybody else? Thank you.